Well, I'm not the child of Holocaust survivors. I was brought up with it, of course, as every Jew is. And my way of dealing with it is to approach it in a scholarly fashion, in some ways a dispassionate fashion, to try to understand what happened. So as I talk, I'm going to tell my helper here to be pressing the PowerPoint slides because I have a few pictures to show. I'd also like to acknowledge all my family and friends who are here tonight. I was going to start with a little joke saying, well, we could just do this at the first Seder. But I see there's a lot of people I don't know, so thank you very much for coming out. In the weeks following the German attack on the Soviet Union on June 22nd, 1941, local inhabitants in hundreds of cities and villages from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea attacked their Jewish neighbors and fellow citizens. They beat them, tormented them, raped them, stole their possessions, and frequently murdered them in the most brutal manner. This intercommunal violence, it's important to remember, took place in a brief spurt, basically from June 22nd, 1941 until about August 1941, about a 6-week period, but stretched over a broad swath of territory of tremendous ethnic diversity. Can you press it again? Sorry, I didn't realize I wouldn't have it in front of me. Again, that's Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi attack on the Soviet Union. Again. The Germans rolled through very quickly, and I'll be talking a little bit about that. Please press it again. In the areas for which I have fairly complete data, that is, in the 3,000 villages of eastern Poland, western Ukraine, western Belarus, in about 300 places, 300 small towns, shtetls, these pogroms occurred. And what I'm defining as a pogrom, just to start off, if the Germans come in and kill everybody, it's not a pogrom. It has to be the locals who carry it out. Please press it again. Famous examples of this are Wed May, Kopstien, Lviv, and Borislav. Some of you may even have family from these towns. A few examples from across the region illustrate the class of events in question. In the Lithuanian city of Kovno, on June 25th, 1941, a German army photographer, which is how we actually know about this, witnessed a pogrom in which a Lithuanian man beat to death 45 to 50 people with a crowbar, one by one, over the course of 45 minutes. Onlookers, women and children included, clapped. When he finished, they sang along as he played the national anthem on an accordion. This was but one act in a larger pogrom. Go on, press it again. That's Lvov in 1941 in Ukraine. That is during the pogrom that occurs on July 1st, 1941. Please press it again. This is the Iași pogrom in Romania, in which, go on, press it, in which thousands died. And then finally, I just described to you the Kovno pogrom. Press it again. This is an actual picture of the garage that I just described to you. That is the man that I just described to you. What's worth looking at this picture for a moment in order to understand it as a pogrom? There are actually, if you go on YouTube, you can see there are videos of pogroms posted on YouTube. It's worth noting, first of all, that there's civilian men in the front. If you look at the right side of the picture, that fellow with the white armband and a weapon, he's a Lithuanian. He's not a German. He's a member of the Lithuanian Activist Front, which is a nationalist organization. If you look at the very back, those are German soldiers at the back. So this is the basic structure of events. On July 7th, some 200 kilometers to the south in the Polish residents of the city Radziwiłł in the Białystok region drove the town's Jews into a barn and burned them alive. Identical incidents occurred in Waszów 2 days before, and in Wed May, famously, 3 days later, when Jews were forced by local Poles to march through the city streets before being murdered en masse, while peasants from surrounding villages brought carts expecting to loot Jewish property. Please press on. My question here tonight is why? Please press it again. These events did not happen everywhere. From a statistical standpoint, they happened in about 10% of places. That is to say, they didn't happen in most places. It's very difficult to get a pogrom going. We know this because we have the Einsatzgruppenberichte, the reports of the German mobile killing units, in which they complained that they tried to get them going. Please press it again. So I want to start with a very simple question. Why do pogroms happen in some locations and not in others? Why do neighbors kill neighbors? Please press it again. What kind of places were these? Did they share common characteristics? I mean, from a social science standpoint, could we have predicted a pogrom in advance? That's maybe too much to ask, right? But it maybe can get us some purchase on why this kind of thing happens. Please press it again. But first, I want to provide you with some conventional explanations, and they're the ones we kind of already know, but I find them unsatisfactory. Please press it again. Press it one more time. There was, of course, the orders that were given on June 29th by Reinhard Heydrich to the heads of the 4 Einsatzgruppen, A, B, C, and D, who were invading the Soviet Union, where he says, nothing is to be put in the way of the self-cleansing actions of the anti-communist and anti-Jewish circles in the newly occupied areas. On the contrary, without a trace, they are to be unleashed and, when necessary, to be intensified and steered onto the right path. We have this telegram. We know this is what the Germans wanted to do. But even with these orders in hand, the evidence is clear that the Germans frequently failed to set off pogroms and expressed frustration where they could not. For example, in Belarusian areas, they frequently had trouble starting pogroms. Not everywhere, but in most places. A further piece of information cast doubt on the notion this was purely a German affair. In many localities, pogroms occurred in the chaos before the Germans arrived, after they had left, or with very little German help. The similarities in pogrom rituals, and the pogrom rituals are clear. And I should say in advance how I know this, because I'm not going to talk about sources very much tonight. They're really the best sources on all of this. You can look at Yizkor books. They're online at JewishGen. JewishGen.org. You can find hundreds of Yizkor books, many of them translated into English. But really the best source that we have is at the Jewish Historical Institute in Poland, where from 1945 to 1947, 7,200 testimonies of Jewish survivors were taken. Those are available. They're not online. I have them. They're on they fit neatly on 4 discs. They're each about 12 pages long. They were beautifully taken. And it was at a time when memories were still very fresh. They didn't know, for example, in 1946, whether there were any children left. Some of the testimonies are from 14-year-olds. Some are from 18-year-olds. Most are given in Polish. Some are given in Yiddish. Some in Russian. Some in German. Over the years, some more have flowed into a second collection. There's the 301 collection, which has the 7,200, and then there's the 302 collection, which has several hundred testimonies which have flowed in over the years, and they continue to flow in from survivors. Generally, they're not as reliable. You can corroborate this, of course, with the Yad Vashem testimonies. Sometimes those are the same, and with the Yizkor books, and with the German, and of course with the German documents themselves. Put together, we have a fairly good picture of what happened. There was similarities in pogrom rituals. Oftentimes the Jews were asked to come into the town square. They were asked to sing Jewish songs. They were forced to sing Jewish songs. They would have to carry Torah scrolls. They would be marched off towards a cemetery. There was a strange combination of Zionist and deeply religious rituals, and at this time, of course, in eastern Poland and western Ukraine, the Orthodox and the Zionists often didn't talk to each other very much. But in this instance, they were all forced together. And they were marched off, oftentimes to a cemetery, where they were beaten, tormented, and then killed. the Germans were everywhere. And the evidence suggests that they could not set up pogroms everywhere. And so that suggests that that's an unsatisfactory explanation. The Germans were a necessary condition, but they were not a sufficient condition. Right? There would have been no pogroms had there been no World War II, but clearly the existence of the Second World War was not enough. Please press the... One more time, please. The pogroms took place in a restricted time frame, June and July 1941. They also occurred within a specific geographic space, the borderlands, occupied by the Soviet Union from 1939 to 1941. Here is a fact. No pogroms happened east of this territory, that is, in the eastern part of the Soviet Union. It's not to say Jews weren't massacred. They were massacred in tremendous numbers by Germans. But the local outrages did not happen east of this territory. It's interesting to note that they also did not happen west of this territory, in Germany itself, and they also did not occur in central and western Poland, which the Germans had occupied from 1939 to 41. What is it about Soviet rule in the newly acquired territories that led to pogrom violence? For many, Soviet rule had become one long ordeal of degradation and humiliation. It marked the end of national independence for Poland and ultimately thwarted the national aspirations of patriotic Ukrainians. Soviet authorities expropriated property, arrested, imprisoned, and deported local elites and all ethnic groups, and showed a callous disregard for local languages and religious traditions. Now, much ink has been spilled on the welcome given to Soviet soldiers as they entered the communities in Western Poland and Ukraine. Although generalization is hazardous, most scholars agree that the Soviets were met by Jews with relief. That is, in one scholar's words, as the lesser of two evils. They were welcomed by the Ukrainians with a measure of hope. That is, the Soviets had created a Soviet Ukrainian Republic, hope for genuine autonomy and ethnic advantage, and by the Poles with a good deal of fear. After all, they were the conquered nation. Of course, not all Jews, Ukrainians, and Poles fit these categories, but they're probably appropriate characterizations of the median reaction. A minority of Jews and Ukrainians, it is clear from the testimonies of Jews themselves, greeted the Soviets with enthusiasm. This raises the questions. Were the Jews the distributional beneficiaries of Soviet rule? Now, some were, but the vast majority clearly were not. What's clear is that the big losers of the initial occupation were ethnic Poles, who immediately lost ownership of the state. They were replaced by local Ukrainians and Jews, as well as officials arriving from the east. Polish schools became Ukrainian. Nationalization of Polish and Jewish businesses quickly followed. Artisans were compelled to join cooperatives, and virtually the entire spectrum of political parties, Polish, Ukrainian, Jewish, and civic organizations disappeared overnight. It's interesting to note that Bundist and Zionist leaders were arrested, and they were sent off to Siberia. This proved fateful because they survived because of this. Those who were deported to Siberia, not all, some died, but disproportionately survived. They were much better off than the Jews who actually remained. The irony is that the Soviets ensured that their deepest enemies survived the war. Many Ukrainians looked upon the new order as a chance for genuine autonomy. This is in the Ukrainian areas. But most were quickly disabused of this notion. The new rulers quickly removed cherished national symbols, replaced Ukrainian narratives of history with, quote, internationalist ones, and doled out police and bureaucratic functions along political rather than ethnic lines. So the question is, how did Soviet rule affect ethnic relations? Before turning to this question, it's important to be realistic about ethnic relations before the arrival of the Soviets. The 1930s saw significant deterioration of relations between Poles, Jews, and Ukrainians in the eastern borderlands, the area that we're talking about tonight. The period between the collapse of Poland in September 1939 and the establishment of Soviet rule in Western Ukraine entailed a measure of violence between Poles and Ukrainians, and by Ukrainians against Jews. In towns temporarily occupied by the Germans, in September, Germans themselves carried out selective persecutions before they left. Although some Jews did flee to the German part of Poland after the arrival of the Soviets, a far larger number poured eastward, over the new Soviet frontier in search of physical security. This indeed swelled the Jewish population in towns that became Western Ukraine. Henryk Schipper, who I don't really know who he is, but he left in the Polish archives an absolutely fascinating unpublished memoir. He captures the highlights of Soviet rule from the Jewish standpoint. Reporting from Lvov, Schipper writes that the economy deteriorated immediately, well below the level of what the Soviets had called fascist pre-1939 Poland. And I quote, "The inept Soviet propaganda did not help. It did not explain," the Soviets did, "the need for sacrifice. Instead, it continued to refer to landlords' Poland and contrast it with the paradise of the USSR." He notes, all Ukrainian and Polish grievances against Bolsheviks found their expression in antipathy towards the Jews, who were seen as accomplices. After all, the Jews were close. The Bolsheviks were far away. It was easier to express anger against the former for the sins of the latter, unquote. Then Schipper writes, how indeed did the Jews behave under Soviet rule? After acknowledging the abuse of communist authority, Schipper says the following: wherever the Soviets repressed the population, they repressed the Jews just as much. So in 1940, many prominent Jewish merchants, landlords, as well as industrialists were deported east to the provinces. Among officers and their families, Jews were not spared. Those of you who know about the Katyn massacre, where the Soviets carried out against Polish officers, of the 21,892 Polish officers killed during 1940, some 8% of their victims were Jews. These were Jewish officers in the Polish army, corresponding roughly to their percentage in the Polish population. Still, and this has to be admitted, for Schipper and many like him, the achievement of Soviet rule was, and I quote, the factual emancipation and equalization of citizenship. It was this simultaneous experience of terror and emancipation that Ukrainians, and especially Poles, did not always share with their fellow citizens, fellow Jewish citizens. In fact, most accounts indicate that after favoring the Jews in some administrative posts initially, by 1940, most had been replaced by Ukrainians. What mattered most, however, was not reality, but perception. Soviet repression affected all three ethnic groups, although at different times and with different intensities. Of the 66,000 arrests in Western Ukraine between September 1939 and May 1941, 22,000 were Poles, 23,000 Ukrainians, and 13,000 were Jews. In 2 nights alone, on April 12th and 13th, 1940, approximately 8,000 Poles from Lvov were deported to the interior of the Soviet Union, and on the next night, the 14th, Jewish politicians and Zionist leaders were arrested and sent eastward. And perhaps most critically, of the 20,000 prisoners in custody in Western Ukraine on June 10, 1941, the majority of whom were Ukrainians, but there were also a significant number of Poles and Jews. Approximately 4,000 were deported east, 7,000 suspected or previous or serious criminals remained in prison temporarily, and most faithfully, more than 8,700 in the hands of the NKVD, that is the Soviet secret police, were murdered just before the Germans arrived. In many testimonies, the discovery of the corpses by arriving German units are linked to the violence that followed. In Lvov, Germans and local Ukrainians forced Jews to dig up corpses from mass graves and retrieve them from jails before they incited a pogrom themselves against the Jewish population of the city. Pogroms unfolded in similar fashion in Sambir, Stri, Borislav, Zolochiv, and other towns of eastern Galicia. Did the prison massacres cause the pogroms? The NKVD prison massacres, I would argue, probably made the pogroms worse where they occurred. But the location of NKVD prisons and the pogrom locations do not map neatly onto each other. I've done this work. The number of pogrom locations in Ukraine alone, in Western Ukraine, in Galicia, 124 locations, far exceeds the number of NKVD prisons, about 18. These murders were therefore a sufficient, but not a necessary condition for pogrom violence. There is no evidence that Soviet rule was any worse in villages and towns where pogroms occurred compared to where they did not. In small towns and villages, Jews were taken by complete surprise. I have numerous testimonies on this, by pogroms, and they drew no connection to Soviet rule. Some Jews even wrote to German authorities asking them to stop the pogroms. Ukrainians, a further piece of evidence is that Ukrainians who collaborated with Soviet authorities were largely spared the retribution of their fellow Ukrainians. According to one eyewitness, in July 1941, soldiers returning to Bolachów, if you're Polish, wearing Soviet uniforms, for example, they were killed only if they were Jews. And if those of you who read Daniel Mendelssohn's 6 of the 6 Million, that's from that book. And Schiffer notes, somewhat tacitly, all Ukrainians agreed to peace. Nobody was attacked for participating in the Soviet administration. In short, the evidence indicates that the pogroms were less the product of anti-Soviet than anti-Jewish sentiments. This observation raises the question of nationalism and anti-Semitism, which is what we proceed to next. Please hit the one more time. I'm going to depart from my notes here for a minute and just explain who these characters are. What we have here are two major nationalist leaders. On the left, we have Stepan Bandera, the leader of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. Many of you don't know. Actually, many of you are older, you probably do know. After World War I, Ukrainians were thwarted in their aspirations to found a national state. Ukraine was divided up between the Soviet Union, where Central and Eastern Ukraine were, and Western Ukraine, 5 million Ukrainians in Poland. The Ukrainians in Poland were deeply unhappy. After being promised autonomy, they were not given it. They initially tried terrorism, and then they moved into politics. In 1925, 1926, they participated in the 1928 election in Poland. They do pretty well. There's 5 million of them in Poland. But by 1929, there's a new radicalization. This guy, Stepan Bandera, along with other Ukrainians, founds the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the OUN, if you're a Ukrainian. It's founded in Vienna in 1929. They're hardliners. They're hardliners. They're seriously anti-Semitic. They're seriously anti-Polish. They admire Mussolini. They don't quite come out at this point and argue for the mass extermination of Jews. I'm going to return to Bandera in a minute. Next week, on the right, is Roman Dmowski, the leader of anybody here from Poland, the Endecja, right? The National Democrats. The National Democrats, of course, a misnamed party. They're not very democratic. The National Democrats believed in a Poland for the Poles. Ukrainians and Belarusians, who as I just said, there are a lot of in Poland, they were to be assimilated. Their schools were to be closed. They were to be converted to Roman Catholicism. They were seen as fodder for assimilation. The Jews, however, were unassimilable, according to Dmowski. Many Jews in Poland thought initially that they could politically assimilate, or even culturally assimilate. And over time, many Jews did speak Polish. I just had a lovely conversation in Polish with a woman at the front here. Many Jews learned Polish very well. But according to Dmowski, the competition between Jews and Poles was zero-sum. Why? Because Dmowski saw Poland as a modern, urban, capitalist nation. This was the group, the Jews, that could not be assimilated to this vision. The competition between Jews and Poles was direct. Now, let me talk for a minute about Bandera and the OUN. These were two the common narrative of the Holocaust, and especially this portion of the Holocaust, this 6-week period in which locals carry out pogroms against Jews, is that it was these characters and their followers who did the evil. There's a lot of evidence for this. There's a huge amount of evidence for this. In many of the narratives, the survivors speak of Ukrainians wearing yellow and blue armbands. We also know that just before the war, the Abwehr, the German counterintelligence, organized the Ukrainian nationalists and basically told them, go in and carry out pogroms. Get locals to do this. There are a couple of problems with this explanation. That is, blaming it all on the organization of the Ukrainian nationalists. And I'm going to name a few of them. First of all, the Polish nationalists were not organized by the Germans. Dmowski was despised by the Germans. The Germans largely imprisoned Polish nationalists. So they weren't armed by them, they weren't fed by them, they weren't clothed by them, they were not trained by the Germans. There were a lot of Polish nationalists, but the Germans didn't put them up to it. As for the Ukrainians, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists was a fanatic organization. It was deeply anti-Semitic. The evidence is that they followed the Germans into their ideology of mass extermination of the Jews. The fact of the matter is that there were too few of them. There were only about 10,000 members of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists in all of Ukraine. They didn't have the numbers to pull this off. And there's one other thing I want to say about this. If you blame it all on Bandera, as bad as he was, believe me, he's bad. And there are Bandera statues all over Western Ukraine today. Right? It's a total shanda. As bad as this guy was, the problem with placing all the blame on him and his several thousand followers is that it lets off the hook the Ukrainian nation. Pogroms, as far as we know, were mass phenomena. They didn't just include a few members of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists. Nationalism and anti-Semitism certainly played an important role in June and July 1941. But it remains an open question, I would argue, how important the presence of nationalist networks were in determining where pogroms did and did not occur. With OUN, Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, spread over hundreds of towns and villages with orders to incite pogroms, in the end, in Ukraine, they only managed to do so in 13% of villages. Please press the next slide. So what kinds of communities were they? So now we're getting to my punchline. What kinds of communities? I want to know where pogroms happened and why. And as important as the Germans were, clearly, I'm not here to deny that. As important as the Soviet occupation was, obviously they didn't occur anywhere else except where the Soviets had occupied. And as important as the existence of the nationalist networks were, they can't explain where they happened. And that's where I turn my own set of tools on this. Do pogrom and non-pogrom localities differ in systematic ways that we can identify? How can we know? So what I do is I open the basic tool chest. And when I did this book, I was shocked that nobody ever thought of doing this before. The basic tool chest of social science. Look at these villages. So what I did is, I got a gigantic grants to go over to Poland and unearth the censuses and all the voting data from the 1920s and 30s. I figured the only way I could reconstruct all of these villages in a systematic way is know who lived there, how many Jews lived there, what percentage were in business, what percentage were in agriculture, what percentage were in the intelligentsia, what political parties did they vote for. In interwar Poland, there were 23 Jewish political parties. Goes to show you that not that much has changed in the Jewish political community if you've ever been involved in synagogue politics. Everything ranging from the Poalei Zion left, that were essentially communists, to the Agudah Yisrael, who were Orthodox Jews who were associated largely with business people. And everything in between. And that's one way we can reconstruct what these lives, what life was like in the villages, all the way down to the village level. And so what I did is I gathered together the world's largest data set, right, on a spreadsheet, on an Excel file, right, of every single village in all of Poland. And had entered, with teams of research assistants here at the University of Toronto, all of this data. What did I find? Next slide. Well, I want to show you just one part of what I found. Look up in the northeast there, that's the Białystok region. And then just south to it is Polesie. I'm going to point to it, here and here. I'm not going to show you all of my data, because you would all, for me it's absolutely fascinating. You'll be deeply snoozing in no time, I realize that. So I'm just going to concentrate on this area. What is special about this area? What's special about this area is that it consists of mostly Poles, right? Especially the Białystok region is almost completely Polish, except in the eastern part, it's largely Belarusian. There are large Polish populations. The Poles in this area tended to be deeply patriotic and nationalist. Even the peasants were nationalist. And that wasn't all that usual in Poland. Most nationalism in Poland tended to be concentrated in urban areas. So it was a deeply nationalist area. It was also very Jewish. There were, apart from Białystok, there were other major cities, some of you may have heard of, Łomża, of course, Brest-Litovsk, Pinsk, lots of cities in this area that you may have heard of before from grandma and grandpa, or maybe mom and dad. Please press the... No, go on. Forward. Okay. Press it again. Okay, there's a table. Let me explain to you this table. It's very easy. Well, all I've done here is I've divided up all of Poland, all of this part of Poland, the Białystok and Polesie region, into two groups. Pogroms and no pogroms. Simple exercise. All the cities. There were 56 pogroms, right, in one group, and the places where didn't have pogroms, 296 places. And I'm interested in here, was there systematic difference? And all this is, people who have math phobia are starting to get nervous, I realize that. Medians, which is kind of like means, it's kind of like averages, but not. Okay? I'm not going to get into that. Right? It's like an average. For intensive purposes, that's what this is. Okay? And there are three groups of data that I have here. One is the top four are demographic. That is, who lived there? Right? The second two are political, and I'm going to explain those in a minute. So let's look at the top four. What's really obvious is, and in some ways this shouldn't be surprising, pogroms happened, if you look at line 2, where the Jews were the overwhelming minority in the population. On average, 41% of the population happened where pogroms occurred. Now, on the one hand, that's kind of not a very surprising finding. After all, if you're a good, rational pogromist, you want to go where the victims are, right? And so, on the other hand, you would think that if the Jews were in larger numbers, and we know this from Zionist history, Zionists tended to spend their scarce resources in those places where there were more Jews. You would expect pogromists to face resistance. It would be easier to kill off Jews where there were fewer of them. You would expect less resistance. So on the one hand, it may be an obvious finding. On the other hand, it's not an obvious finding. The other thing really to look at here is the number of Belarusians. That is to say, and we know this from the Nazi files, the pogromists tended not to be Belarusians. And why? Because Belarusians, and this is actually quite an interesting little finding, Belarusians tended not even to know they were Belarusians. What do I mean by that? They were not yet mobilized in nationalist politics. Right? There were some intelligentsia. But just to give you an example, in the 1931 Polish census, they asked Belarusians, they gave them a choice. What are you? Right? And they gave them a choice. You could answer Tuteishi. Now that is, you're from here. You're a here. Right? You're not a Belarusian, you're not a Jew. It wasn't, Poles knew they were Poles, Jews knew they were Jews. Belarusians, by and large, understood themselves to be Orthodox peasants. That is, Christian Orthodox peasants. They were not yet mobilized into national politics. They did not yet view the Jews as enemies of national politics. The next two groups of four are far more interesting, however. Collectively, here's what they show, and I'm going to tell you this in a minute. Pogroms tended to occur where Jews were mobilized into Jewish national politics. Where Jews voted for Jewish parties, they were slaughtered. Where Jews voted for Polish parties, they were spared. I want to talk about what this means in a minute. Let me go through this slide very carefully, or at least point you to the more important findings. The Zionist vote in 1928. Where pogroms occurred, it was 22%. That's in a proportional representation system. Remember, there are dozens of parties. To get 22% of the vote of any group is a big win. That was a big win for the Zionists. Where pogroms did not occur, they only got 1% of the vote. What did it mean to vote Zionist? What did it mean to vote Zionist? This is 1928 data, right? 13 years before the events in question. In 1928, to vote Zionist did not mean, what did it not mean? It did not mean you were moving to a piece of sand in the desert. It did not mean you intended to make Aliyah. It did not mean that yet. It meant you liked the idea of a state of Israel, you liked the idea of Jewish rights, you liked the idea of Jewish communal autonomy, of Hebrew schools, of having no Sunday closing laws. That was always used to discriminate against Jews in Poland. You like the idea of having even taxation between cities and the countryside. But it did not mean you were intending to leave Poland. The vast majority of these people who voted for these parties, everything we know about this tells us they did not intend to leave Poland. Why? The best evidence is the following. That these people who voted for the Zionists in 1928, in the 1938 local elections, I'm not going to show the slide, they voted for the Bund. That is, they turned around from being Hebraists to being Yiddishists. They weren't actually Yiddishists. They weren't actually Hebraists at this point. Most of the Zionist press in Poland was published in Polish. Now that's actually not that surprising. Right? The Canadian Zionist press is largely not in Hebrew either. It's in English. It's in the language that we know. To be a Zionist was in interwar Poland to say, I am not going to join the Polish nation-building project. I am not a Pole. I am a Jew. I am willing to be part of Poland. I am willing to be inside of Poland, but as a Jew. Every one of these Jewish politicians, and these Zionists were led by a guy named Yitzhak Grunbaum, who's also an interesting character. Yitzhak Grunbaum stays in Poland until 1935. He emigrates to Israel, where he becomes Israel's first minister of the interior after 1948. These Jews were willing, and Yitzhak Grunbaum was very eager to serve in a Polish government. Not one Jew, not one German, not one Ukrainian, not one Belarusian member of parliament in the Sejm, the Polish parliament, was a cabinet minister in interwar Poland. They wanted to be members of the Polish government. They were not allowed to The Poles viewed these parties, and this we know from the archives, the Jewish parties, as subversive, as deeply subversive. What I want to argue here is that in the villages, and I'm not going to go through the rest of the slide. The rest of the slide basically makes my point. In those villages where Jews were mobilized into their own nation-building project, and where there were a lot of them, that's where the locals turned on. Why? Here I think you need to think a little bit historically. Not back in time, but forward from the standpoint of 1941. You see, in 1941, nobody knew yet what was going to happen to the Jews. The Jews didn't know what was going to happen to the Jews. The Poles didn't know what was going to happen to the Jews. Even the Germans themselves did not know what was going to happen to the Jews. That would not be sealed until 1942. In the summer of 1941, this, for Poles, was their one opportunity to gain political and national advantage once and for all. Now, I'm a political scientist, so I tend to see things through political lenses. Yes, it's about anti-Semitism. Yes, it's about the Germans. Yes, it's about the Soviet occupation. But it's also about politics. It's also about the failure of the Polish nation-building project. When Poland was founded in 1918, only 2/3 of the population was Polish. But they chose to make a unitary Poland for Poles, by Poles and for Poles. And the other nations in Poland refused to join this nation-building project. And the Jews themselves refused to join this nation-building project. This is what the Zionist vote represented. And this is why they were slaughtered in July 1941. Please go to the next slide. Okay, so this summarizes my results. Pogroms tended to occur where there were a lot of Jews and where they were mobilized into Jewish politics. I am not blaming the Jews for their own misfortune. I'm simply saying this was the situation in Poland at the time. Of course, from the standpoint of social science, you could say were there fewer Jews who were voting for political parties that were not Jewish, there would not have been these pogroms. That is largely true. But that doesn't mean that the Jews were not entitled to their national politics. After all, the Poles had their national politics, the Ukrainians had their national politics, the Italians had their national politics, the French had theirs, and the Jews had theirs. Two major conclusions, though, really result from this. I'm used to having my computer in front of me, which is why I know it's bad form to look away, but I can't see my own notes in front of me. First, I think what this tells us is a kind of a hidden story of political assimilation. Where Jews voted for Polish parties, where there was a kind of what does it mean to vote for the same party as someone else? Doesn't mean you love them. It doesn't mean you're their brother. It doesn't even mean you respect them. It's a bare minimum of solidarity. It's the bare minimum. Remember what I said before. It's very hard to get pogroms going. It's very easy to stop them. So that's number one. There's a story here about political assimilation which may even go beyond Jews. It may apply to our own multicultural society. And number two, this is perhaps my more controversial finding. I'm writing the final chapter of the book right now, so I'm not sure I'm going to stick with it, but let me throw it out on the table. Most discussions of survivors, of rescuers, of perpetrators, focus on individuals. They focus on individuals. Good Poles, righteous Poles, right? The largest group of the righteous among nations at Yad Vashem are Poles. Well, that's not that surprising. That's where the Jews were. They focus on individuals, or they focus on bad individuals, the priest who wouldn't help or would help. My research really points to something else. It points to the context. in some places, it was just easier to be good. It was easier to be good. It was easier to be righteous, where the community was already conditioned for the right sort of behavior. I want to end by talking about a real pogrom. This is one of my testimonies. I'll be 2 more minutes. Chaya Soika Golding gave this in 1947 in Amsterdam. Talks about June 22nd, 1941, and the Germans. They hung up their swastika flag and they pushed on further. The city lay in chaos. Authority passed to the hands of the Poles. This lasted about 2 weeks. All kinds of rowdies were let out of prison. Dąbrowski, Jakubczyk, the well-known Polish arrestees under the Bolsheviks, the chief of the guard, Yankaulitis, the director of the schools, and others. They were full of rancor for the Bolshevik and the Jews. Friday night, when the entire city slept, the slaughter began. They, the Poles, had organized it very well. 1 gang in the New Section, a 2nd in the Marketplace, a 3rd in Lomger streets. There in the New Section, they murdered Romovsky's family, the tailor, Esther Krieger, your neighbor and youngest daughter. This was a letter that I'm reading. Sorabella, Einekol, Pishke, a few other Yiddish names that I won't go into here, all at the head of the yeshiva, all in their own houses, and many more. They had killed Rosenthal's children in the marketplace. They'd also killed Tejka with her 6-month-old child at breast, and her older boy, Grishin. Later, the squads divided up the possessions of their victims amongst themselves. On readied wagons, they loaded the corpses and led them just outside the town. The Goyim immediately washed the bloody floors, including the stones on the street. A few hundred sacrifices had taken place in one night, and still the murderers informed us the massacres would continue for 2 more nights. Now the elements are all there. The Soviet occupation, the collapse of authority, the riot agitators, the hatred, the fear, the rage of the nationalist crowd, the thirst for revenge, blood and booty, and ultimately the intimate violence are all contained within this short narrative. She knew their names, the names of the perpetrators. What came next, however, provides crucial clues to the permissive communal context in which the pogrom could occur and deepen. So let me return to her letter. And I quote, "Those remaining were stricken with fear. What do we do? How can we save ourselves? My mother ran to the priest to beg for the Jews. They offered no help. With Hanna, Liba, Zemel, and Salem, I ran to the Polish intelligentsia. There too we found no salvation. My mother with 2 other women ran after help to Grajeva, a nearby town. They were not let into the town. Curfew. What to do? Night was falling upon us. Approximately 20 Germans entered the city, a field troop. We were afraid to show ourselves before them. Then I had an idea, to try our luck with the soldiers. Maybe they would help us. With great difficulty, we chose a delegation and departed. The group of Germans consisted of soldiers and 2 officers. In the beginning, they declined to help us. This is not our business. We're fighting on the front, not with civilians, they explained. However, when I offered them soap and coffee, they softened up. They guarded the city at night and all remained quiet. I, with 2 other women, began to work for them, and later we were placed to work in the German headquarters. And so in this manner, the pogroms in Kopstien, the town in question here, were stopped for a while. This passage indicates that what allowed the pogrom to get off the ground and intensify was not merely hatred, hostility, and rage, but also the quite obvious indifference of key members of the local Polish community towards the fate of the town's Jews. Kopstien's Jewish women expected something different. Their first instinct, once they understood their predicament, was to turn to the priest and the intelligentsia, whom they believed could have stopped the bloodshed. But neither the priest nor the intelligentsia, an especially broad category in Eastern Europe, were moved by the frantic appeals of the petrified women to intervene. A point stressed in several written testimonies, not only this one. Neither lifted a finger nor showed any signs of solidarity with their fellow Jewish citizens. The women did not encounter hatred in their marches. They reported no reaction, no help, remember the quote, no salvation, nothing. They met indifference. Whether they also offered soap and coffee. It took me many times reading that quote before I actually understood. Whether they also offered soap and coffee to the Polish men remains unknown. It's also difficult to determine whether the town's Polish spiritual and educated elite set the tone for the pogrom or merely reacted to the context in which they lived. My statistical findings, however, point to the context. In Kopstien, a town where 56% of the 4,000 inhabitants were Jewish, 88% of whom voted for Jewish parties in 1922, 85% in 1928, and where the communists, and something I can talk about in the question and answer, received a mere 2% of the vote. The Jews and Poles were already polarized, and the stage was set for a pogrom. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kopstien. If anybody has some questions, would they please raise their hand and come forward to the front where you can speak on the microphone. And we'll start with this gentleman here. Please come forward. Thank you. Yes. And others could line up if you'd like behind.
Thank you very much. It's been very informative. The one thing I did notice from your chart was that the number of pogroms, greater number, showed a greater number of Zionists, and the other side, of course, didn't. And it always struck me through my research as an amateur that a large part of the anti-Semitism occurred to those who were Zionists, partly because of their religion. I know that the Poles were very, very observant Catholics, and the Polish Church never stopped telling them how we massacred their deity and all the other things that comes from the Catholic source of anti-Jewishness. And I'm just wondering if that, whether you research whether the Zionists were more observant, more orthodox, and perhaps the other side that were not subject to this many pogroms.
So it's a good question. The Zionists were, they were not unreligious or anti-religious. They tended to try to, it's interesting, the Zionists were divided up into several groups, right? There was Poale Zion on the left, right, which eventually you'll get the Labour Party out of. And there were religious Zionists, the Mizrahi movement, right? And they were religious Zionists because that was an attempt by the Orthodox rabbis, because what was happening is that the Orthodox, Jewish Orthodox started up a party had been started outside of Poland called Agudas Israel, right? Which was an attempt to mobilize, because at first the Orthodox didn't even want to get involved in politics at all. They just said, look, we'll just have our own little group, and we'll have our synagogues, and we'll have our own tax base, and we won't have to worry about the Poles. But they soon figured out that that was a problem in two respects. One, the Poles weren't going to leave them alone. And secondly, they were losing their youth to non-religious parties. So they started up this religious party. The party was pretty successful. It declared itself to be loyal to Poland. You'll notice if you go backward to the table, you've got to press backward. There you go. There's Agudas Israel, right? Getting 4% of the vote, right? It's not, look, getting 4% of the vote is pretty good, right? And pretty good in a proportional representation system. It means you're a pretty powerful party. Remember, when there are dozens of parties, 4% is okay. But over time, the appeal of Zionism, of Jewish nationalism, right? That is assertive Jewish politics. The Agudas still believed in the old style, what's the Yiddish word for it? Shtadlonis. Shtadlonis. That is Jewish intercession. The rabbi would quietly go speak to the powers that be and try to settle the problems of the community. Young Jews didn't want that anymore. They wanted to be proud. They didn't want it to have quietly done by a rabbi. They wanted to go out and vote and capture seats in parliament. And so the Zionists started attracting more and more votes from Agudas Israel. And so the response of the Zionists, of course, was to diversify their portfolio. And so the largest group of Zionists, run by Yitzhak Grunbaum, and in Galicia, run by a guy named Leo Reich, they tended to avoid the question of religion, right? Because they wanted both religious and non-religious people to be voting for them. But whoever it was an assertive nationalism. You know, in the gay community, there's this expression, we're queer and we're here, right? It's an assertive identity, right? It's the Jewish equivalent thereof, right? And it's perhaps not a proper analogy to use, but I mean, you understand what I'm saying. It's a nice expression. And it said, we're Jewish and we're here and we're not going anywhere. Some of us might leave, but the vast majority couldn't leave. The British have reduced emigration into Palestine down to a very pathetic amount, a couple thousand a year by the 1930s. And so I think that's basically the answer to your question. There was a religious component to it, but the Zionists tried to not get involved in that fight. There was a big fight between religious and not non-religious, but not as observant Jews within Poland. Especially between the Hasidim and the non-Hasidim, right? This was a big fight in Poland, and the Zionists wished to avoid that fight altogether.
Thank you. Next question, come forward, please.
When you consider Western Europe, I think an important distinction has to be made between the bystanders to the ethnic cleansing, in other words, getting Jews out of Western Europe, and standing by the deportations, and the number of people who would have been knowledgeable in Western Europe as to the actual genocide.
Right.
I'm wondering if your studies have any implications for that dichotomy. Was there such a dichotomy in Poland? Of course, in Poland, there was no deportations. There was the actual genocide in Poland.
Well, there were deportations in Poland. I mean, there were various other parts that weren't that far away. So your question was, did the locals know about the fate of the Jews? The answer is yes, but later on. What's good about my study here, the only thing that makes this tractable, it's too many languages. I mean, I knew Russian, I knew German, I had to learn Polish. I never really learned Yiddish successfully. I had to get people to help me with that. It was too many languages, too much bad old data. It was very unwieldy. The only thing that makes this possible to do is to go through all of these testimonies. It's a 1-month period. The pogroms end, because what happens is the Einsatzgruppen come back in late August, and they kill everybody. Right? So that's the end of this story. Right? The end of this story is all of these people who were perpetrators, they become bystanders. They all become bystanders, because by September, October, right, that's when you start getting the mass shootings, right? And so that's really what that's really what happened. So it's not until later, when the knowledge of what's going to happen, when the Germans start killing masses of people, and that's not really for a couple of months after this. This is a 1-month window in which nobody really knew what was going to happen. Right? Nobody exactly knew how the Germans were going to proceed. Nobody really believed, right, that the Germans were going to dig giant pit. And if you've been to Kiev, I was in Kiev twice last year. It's absolutely remarkable where Baba Yar is. Baba Yar, right? This pit with tens of thousands of massacred Jews. It's almost right downtown. You can walk. Nobody thought that was going to happen so quickly. Nobody thought that was going to happen.
Thank you. Next question.
Is your conclusion based on your analysis of Poland? Is it peculiar to Poland? Or are you thinking of applying it to other communities in Europe or perhaps around the world? Because I'm thinking that it may not apply to other communities. For instance, in Hungary, the Zionist movement was, during the war, just as an example, a very marginal movement. And there, Jews were murdered no matter what their beliefs were.
Absolutely.
So I'm just asking, because to apply the conclusion that if if you were more, you would tend to be killed more easily if you were Zionist rather than if you were pro-Polish, didn't apply at all to a country like Hungary, as one example, or Italy for that matter, where it's a totally different situation again.
It's an excellent question. The question is, how portable is this explanation? Does it actually give you any traction in any other place? After all, in Hungary, the Jews, famously so, right, were disproportionately highly assimilated, not only along religious lines, but of course even more importantly along linguistic lines, and they were largely very pro-Hungarian. If you've ever known Hungarian Jews in Toronto, right, they're amazingly pro-Hungarian, unless their parents were actual, but even when they were actual Holocaust survivors, some of the parents loved to hang out and speak Hungarian with each other and enjoy things Hungarian. Let me answer your question. There is one way in which I think you can get some traction. I've thought a lot about this. In order to do the kind of analysis I have here, you need very, very good extensive data. Right? So I don't have it for anywhere else. It's another person in another life. Right? This took me years to do. Let me say how I think it is portable. Let me apply it to Hungary for a moment. The Jews of Budapest versus the Jews of the countryside. The Jews of the countryside, to the extent that the Jews of Hungary were culturally assimilated, the Jews of Budapest were far more culturally assimilated than the Jews of the countryside, and the Jews of the countryside were given far less assistance than the Jews of Budapest. The Jews who survived in Budapest, and many Jews survived in Budapest, right, survived with not only with the help of Wallenberg, but with also, in many cases, with Hungarian assistance. Let me give you a different example. Greece. The Jews of Athens versus the Jews of Salonika. The Jews of Salonika tended to be Sephardic and not assimilated at all. They tended not to support the dominant national party in Greece. They tended to support more moderate parties, and the dominant nationalists assisted the Germans in their deportation very quickly. The Jews of Salonika were wiped out overnight, very large and old population. The Jews of Athens tended to be more culturally assimilated to the Greek language. They tended to be not as culturally assertive, and they were largely spared. Not completely. The Jews of Athens, many Jews in Athens died. But to the extent that there were Jews assisted by Greeks, they tended to be from Athens and not from Salonika. I could go on with this. Now, there are limits. There are limits, big limits. It can't explain Germany. It can't explain Germany itself. Right? I'm willing to acknowledge the limits of the explanation here, but the fact of the matter is that no one's ever been able to account for this. I was completely shocked that no one's asked this most basic question, right? Which for years and years of Holocaust lectures have talked about survivors, rescuers, communities where people got killed, communities where people didn't get killed. I'm simply trying to ask a simple question: is there a systematic difference between those? I think I found something. How portable it is? Look, right? I'm trying to be fairly modest in my conclusions here. This is a war. There is huge levels of chaos going on, right? Whether data found from the 1920s can account for something that goes on in 1941, in 1 month of 1941. We have to have a certain amount of epistemological modesty here, right? And so that's my claim.
Thank you. We'll take 2 more questions. Mr. Crude, a Holocaust survivor, has a question.
I don't know if this is a question, but I'd like to make a statement. I appreciate all the figures in all the statistics, but I came here to listen the real reason for the Holocaust. Now, the pogroms that took place in Poland between 1920 and 1940 was naturally terrible, disturbing, but the Holocaust did not materialize because of the problems. Germany had a leader, Adolf Hitler. He wrote a book, Mein Kampf, and he brought up a whole nation to kill Jews. And this was the cause of the Holocaust, not the pogroms, but they occurred in certain cities. When the war started, I was 20 years old, So I remember, not from books, I was part of the youth, and I know how Poland, there was anti-Semitic government, which is no denial, and the government was not allowing Jews to go to universities, and they brought up the country to aid Jews. But when the Germans came in, the Germans were able, forgive me, I have a little cold, so my voice is not so clear, but the Germans let the Poles do what they want. The Latvians, the Estonians, but the Germans were the main force, but they organized to kill, to get rid of the 3 million Jews in Poland. But the other countries also had 3 million people. They also killed them too. And over there was not programs. So I was a little disappointed. I thought we would have a lecture about the Holocaust, the major reason for killing the Jews.
Well, we'll have that lecture probably some other time, but appreciate your comments. I'd like to ask Dr. Eisenberg for his question, please, and then we'll have some closing remarks. Thank you very much.
It's been a fascinating talk, and certainly those of us who have political minds to think of parties and polarization and how assertiveness on one side can trigger counter-assertiveness. But if we think that the question is how neighbors kill neighbors, I don't see how all the data can lead one community, the dominant community, 70-80% of the population, to turn and massacre children, babies of a community that may have lived there 500-600 years. And there's a whole other dimension. You can say that in any national struggle you have tension, you have political fights, but to descend to a level of barbarity, I think there's a whole different dimension how you can just butcher your neighbors and their kids and their infants. And I think there's a whole other side to this that we have to ask how this could have happened. And the Germans, of course, knew where to set up their death camps. They didn't set them up in France and Belgium. They set them up in Germany. And I think there's a whole other undercurrent as to, Poland, that how you can lead political struggle on any level can lead to this kind of murder still asks the big question.
So, I agree with you. On the one hand, there's clearly what I'm presenting here is not enough to get at the psychological, level. I'm not a social psychologist. What I really wanted to bring home, though, about Holocaust studies is the following. And I'm not the only one who's doing this now. For the past 3 decades, right, as Holocaust studies has really picked up steam, most studies have looked at the impersonal nature, right? Starting with Hannah Arendt, but it's not just Hannah Arendt, right? Raoul Hilberg, right? The kind of the big giants of Holocaust studies have looked at the impersonal nature of killing. Right? That this could only be done by an industrial society, a society which killed along industrial fashion. The concentration camps were factories where they produced corpses. I mean, we know this has been the narrative for a very long time. The impersonal nature of the killing. We now know that that's an incomplete picture. At least 2 million Jews spoke to their killers in one language or another. Many of these Jews could handle German pretty well. Many Jews could identify their killer by name. Many of them considered them friends. This is a whole different side of the Holocaust, which I'm trying to bring out by moving to the village level. Now, there are really 2 ways of doing that. One is the aggregate way. You know, I should just get rid of that slide because it obviously invokes the feeling that I'm being impersonal by invoking data. The other way, though, What this data really represents are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of testimonies of survivors from these villages who reconstructed as best they could what life was like before the Soviets arrived, when the Soviets arrived, when the Soviets left, and as the Germans rolled in. And so what I'm doing here is I'm distilling a whole lot. Am I missing the psychological dimension? Yes. Indeed, I am. But hopefully what I'm doing is I'm providing a bit of understanding for what happened. Not in order to let people off the hook. I'm not trying to do that either. But what we have here is to try to put it in proportion. In proportion. This happened in about 10% of places. Am I explaining the Holocaust? No. This is a prelude to the Holocaust. I'm not getting at that. If you want to hear about the Holocaust, as Alan said, there are many great lectures. This is one part of the Holocaust. It is in some ways the dress rehearsal for it. And so I agree with you that one could go into this from different kinds of angles and perhaps get more purchase on it. I'm not sure you get more systematic purchase on it than I have here. And that's what I challenge any scholars out there to do.
On behalf of the Beth Avraham Yosef Synagogue of Toronto, I would like to welcome you to the Holocaust Education Week program at the Bayet. This program is sponsored by the Community Liaison Committee of the Synagogue, and I'd like to thank my co-chairs John Sertash and Sharon Shore and Leon Rucker for their help with organizing the program for this evening. I'd also like to thank the people at the Holocaust Education Center, and in particular Mary Siklos, who's been instrumental in organizing this evening's program. I'd like to take this opportunity to recognize Holocaust survivors that may be here in the audience with us this evening. It's important that we never forget the sacrifice that they went through, and I'd like to call upon any Holocaust survivors that are in the audience at this time to stand and be recognized, please. Thank you. Due to unforeseen circumstances, the performance of the Rhapsody composed by Leo Spellman has been postponed to a further date, and please watch the media for information on when that will be coming forward. As many of you know, both of my parents were Holocaust survivors. They came to Canada after the Holocaust and started a new life in Canada. To remember a war, it is common to bring on stage men glorious in uniform, laden with medals. For the most part, they have gone into battle with the expectation of victory and hope of glory. Not so the civilian, not so my parents, Louis and Grynia Furman, Holocaust survivors. The civilian in war is generally driven from home and hearth and is certain of but one thing, that home and hearth will not be there when they return. And they never know if they will return. Indeed, they have little certainty that they will live to return. But this is the fate of the civilian in the path of war. But now, think further. Think of the civilian who is a target of war. That civilian has none of the status of the soldier, nor military means for self-defense, and has little likelihood of being protected by the state where he or she is a citizen. Such was the situation of the European Jew. From 1935 onward, the Jews had a sense of something malignant in the transformation on the European plain. Many immigrated, but soon even that door was shut upon them. Among these civilians was a young woman of the town of Nowy Grójec in eastern Poland, Grunya Matsavich Furman, my mother, Holocaust. Among these civilians was a young woman who fought hard to survive. She had been forced into service as a fitness instructor when the Russians overthrew Poland. When the Germans displaced the Russians in 1941, the Jews of Novogrudok discovered that discrimination had given way to extermination. In attempting to flee the ghetto, Grunya Furman's brother was shot before her very eyes, and her father and mother were taken to the death camps, never to be seen again. She briefly found shelter on a farm, but posing a danger to the farm family, she made her way to the Nabolig forest, where she served out the remainder of the war as a partisan, helping people. And the phrase "served out" is used intentionally, for Grunya Furman had found refuge in one of the great family camps of the resistance under Tuvia Belsky. And those of you who have seen the movie Defiance, I'm sure are familiar with the Belsky story. My parents fought side by side in the underground as partisans with the Belsky brothers. And even though my father was not a Belsky, he was like a brother to them, and they were a brother together. There, my mother worked as a nurse and married my father, Louis Furman, a fellow partisan who had lost his wife and daughter to the Nazis in the extermination of the ghetto in Liden. Louis Furman brought to the partisans his special knowledge as an electrician, blowing up German ammunition trains, and it was sabotaging the German supply lines, as well as rescuing many, actually over 1,000 people from the ghetto. So that while service in a regular force was not possible for such people, clearly my parents, Grunya and Louis Furman, were veterans of World War II, Holocaust survivors, and we should remember them at this time. And we should always, may their shamas have an aliyah. Amen. To live after such suffering is sometimes an impossible burden. And many did not live. But people like Grunya and Louis Furman not only lived, as partisans they fought the incredible sense of moral chaos created by the Nazis. As refugees they made a life in a new land. As citizens, they gave to their community in Newfoundland, where they immigrated to after the war, and then finally to Toronto. And there, their hope was renewed, and they contributed to their community. We have to realize that the past is a door through which we all pass. Behind it is a house of memories from which can inform or deform. Before it is a world of possibilities, some lit with hope, others darkened by despair. For her part in bringing hope, for her service, for her chesed, for her charity work in both the Jewish and non-Jewish community, my mother was honored with the degree of Doctor of Laws honoris causa, the nurse of the woods. From the Nabolig forest, my mother, Holocaust, Grunya Matsavich Furman. My father, Louis Furman, saved countless lives during the Holocaust. He devoted his life to raising a Jewish family in Newfoundland with my mother, helping to build a shul in Newfoundland, a Jewish community, doing tremendous chesed work for both the Jewish and non-Jewish community. He was a chazan in the shul. When he would daven Yom Kippur Kol Nidre, you could hear a pin drop. When someone unfortunately passed away, he was the Chevra Kedusha. When a kid needed to learn bar mitzvah lessons, he was the person who taught them. And he was also honored by the community in Newfoundland with an honorary chair at the Memorial University of Newfoundland. One of the reasons why I have such a passion for Holocaust education and Holocaust Education Week is that my father was one of the first people in North America to have a Holocaust education program. It was open to Jews, initially only, and then subsequently to non-Jews as well. And people from all over, including the premier of the province, came to hear the Holocaust education program. My father also spoke to Yad Vashem, to over 1,000 partisans, and made it very clear during the Holocaust Education Week that we can never forget what happened. I remember as a little boy at the age of 8 in the shul operating the curtain for the Holocaust Education Week program that consisted of Holocaust plays, songs, stories, poems, and lectures on the Shoah. I'll leave you with this thought. We must never forget. We must remember what happened and never let it happen again. We must stand tall and be proud that we are all Jews. And I wanted to share those words with you about my late parents. Thank you. It gives me great pleasure now to introduce our guest speaker for the night, Jeffery Kopstien. Jeffery Kopstien is a professor of political science and director of the Center of Jewish Studies at the University of Toronto. His teaching and scholarly work focus on Eastern European Jewish history and politics. Professor Kopstien holds a BA, MA, and a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. In addition to the University of Toronto, he has taught at Dartmouth College, the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and the University of Colorado at Boulder. He also has Feld scholarships at Harvard University, Princeton University, and has also been an Alexander von Humboldt Fellow at the University of Munich. His research has been supported by the National Science Foundation and the Social Sciences and Research Council of Canada. He has won tremendous awards, including the Outstanding Teaching Award of the University of Toronto's Faculty of Arts and Science. Professor Kopstien is the author of 3 books and more than 40 scholarly articles. His next book is nearing completion and will be released soon. It is titled Intimate Violence, Anti-Jewish Pogroms as a Prelude to the Holocaust, and we look forward to reading it once it's published. That is the theme on which he will speak tonight, and we are very happy that he's been able to join us.